Hello friends, today's theme of discussion is cinema as a teaching pedagogy. As we are aware that cinema has definitely played an important role in the framework of the education, communication as well as entertainment. So from that point of view, we have seen that in recent times cinema has been studied from a serious angle in various academic institutions, and we have also seen that some of the institutes, especially the film institutes, they also try to communicate the various kinds of issues and concerns with regard to cinema and its technology. So in the course of our discussion, what we will try to do is that we will try to study cinema as a teaching pedagogy, that how cinema can be used in the academic discussions and as an academic discourse. In that particular context, we have seen that since the beginning or the arrival of cinema in India from 1896 onwards, definitely how it was connected with the national movement which was happening at that point of time, and the undercurrents of cinema could be seen during that particular period. We have also seen that in 1950s, when India was independent and the idea of nation building was an important concern. So some of the films, they were talking about that idea in the 1950s and 60s as well. Then the 70s decade, which has been seen in the framework of the anti-establishment with the coming of the emergency and the various kinds of issues in terms of unemployment, poverty, etc., where people they were not happy in that sense, and they realized that the cinema of the 1970s was with the angry young man, Amitabh Bachchan as the angry young man, where we find that many of the films, they were anti-establishment in that sense, and how the justice was to be in a way sought through their own means. Many times these means, they were violent in nature as well. Thereafter in 80s, we find that the similar kind of trend continues, and in the 1990s, when the liberalization happens, then we find that there is a lot of experimentation in the films. So cinema as a teaching pedagogy is in the context of the socio-economic historical developments which were happening in those times, and how cinema was trying to reflect that particular kind of a reality in that particular period. So when we tend to see cinema, many a times it is also being rejected by some of the academicians and the people, those who are associated with the academics, that it is not doing enough or it is not a serious kind of a concern. But the way some of the social scientists, some of the historians and scholars, they have tried to see the importance of cinema, we have also realized that cinema definitely is an important kind of a source, not only from the point of view of education, information and communication, but also from the point of view of understanding the society and its reality through celluloid. So in the context of the readings, one can refer to KRM short feature film as history, Gaston Robbers, Another Cinema for Another Society, Mark Ferro, film as an agent, product and source of history, P.S. Holland, film in history, restaging past. All these kinds of readings one can refer when one is talking about cinema. And we also see that cinema and all sorts of visual medium, when they try to communicate the ideas in their own way, then definitely their reach is comparatively more and the impression also lasts longer. So we find that how it can also be used as a powerful tool in guiding the students, enlightening them on the various socio-economic, political, cultural and the academic issues. And some of the films like Gulal, Dil Dosti, etc., they have also been made, which also try to communicate the way students or the kind of the ideas which are concerned with the students. And we have also seen that apart from the way cinema has operated, a number of institutions, they also cater in terms of teaching films, and film institutes like FTI, Film and Television Institute of India, they provide the degree, diploma and the certificate courses. And we also have the film appreciation courses in FTII, and various film departments, they have also been established in the various universities across India and the world. So we find that organized kind of an understanding, organized kind of a study of films is definitely taking place in many of the institutions, and how these institutions, they are able to impart the concerns of cinema, and at the same time how cinema is trying to portray the kind of society which is being reflected. Or at the same time, we also see that how cinema is also borrowing from the society, in the sense that we find that many of the films which have been made, especially in the later times, they have also been seen from the point of view of the kind of social changes which are happening in the society. So they may concern to the women's issues, they may concern to the kind of reforms which are needed in the society. So all that is also being seen in the cinema, and many times you also see that some of the news items which become popular, they have also been in a way shown in the films, they have also been reflected in the films. So when we try to understand cinema, we also see that not only the dialogues but symbols, they also play an important role in how they create appropriate emotional responses as well. So symbols definitely are important in the context that they are culture specific, and when these kinds of symbols they are being shown, then that particular society is able to understand those symbols, because they have certain kind of meanings which are attached to them. And when we tend to understand cinema, then we find that it developed during the active phase of the Indian national movement, and how it was influenced by the ideals and the objectives of the national movement. So in a way, we find that how cinema was in a way interacting with the socio-political realities of those times, and at the same time when it was interacting, it was gaining from those realities as well, because some of the filmmakers later they admitted that they were influenced by the ideas of the national movement, and they were trying to portray some of these concerns through their films in as well. So when you talk about the national movement, when you talk about the kind of period of the national movement from 1885 onwards until 1947, when India achieves independence, we find that that particular phase is also being in a way conveyed through cinema. And one can have some kind of an input or some kind of an insight by studying the films of that particular period. And some of the scholars and social scientists and historians, they've argued that how cinema can be seen as a source of history writing, and how it also conveys the nationalist aspirations and the motives as well. So in that sense, we find that cinema is also involved in the promotion of culture, fashion and identity as well, because in the recent times that how the studies on culture and identity they have become very important, and when one is talking about these kinds of aspects, one realizes that when one is going for the cultural studies or the studies which are related to identity, then we find that all these kinds of aspects they are also evident in the films as well. And when you talk about history writing, how history writing has always been a contested territory, where we find that different kinds of interpretations they have been given by the historians, and how they try to in a way provide some kind of a critique of the various interpretations which have been given by some or the other scholar. So in that way, in a way, nowadays we also see that new kinds of sources they have been talked about, oral history is being talked about in the framework of understanding history. So arguments they have also been made in this regard, that how cinema is a source of historical inquiry, in that sense that how it can be used as a source of history writing as well, as it is a very well documented source. Though critics they have also in a way criticized this kind of an aspect, but there is a criticism of the various kinds of ideas in the historical discourse. So when you talk about the cinema as in the framework of culture, that how the various kinds of dresses, food, gestures, makeup, eating and drinking, all these kinds of practices and moral as well as the spiritual values, they form part of our culture, and culture in that sense is a way of life, that how we tend to understand culture. So in that sense we find that some of the scholars they have talked about film as a source as well as agent of history, and when it is talking as a source of history, then film portrays the relationship with the societies that produce and consume it, and also the social processes which are involved in the making. And when one is talking about as an agent of history, film depicts and promotes particular values, principles and attitudes in given cultures. So Mark Farrow has talked about these kinds of aspects, that how cinema or films, they can be used as a source as well as agent of history. And there are others, they have also tried to see the relation between the history and cinema, and it has also been argued that the history cinema, they also take the past events, and when we are talking about history, then the past events, they are being shown in the similar manner. We also find that cinema is also trying to convey some of the events which have happened in the past. And many times the historians and filmmakers, though they have different kinds of trajectories in terms of their ideas or in terms of their presentations, but we also see that they are the author of their own films. And similarly, historians, they in a way use the sources in a manner with which their own ideological positions are reflected. So their ideological positions are being reflected in the kind of interpretations which are being given by them and the way they use those sources. So we find that for a filmmaker, the film is a complete work, while for a historian, we find that it is a factual raw material in that sense. And we have also seen that how the relation between the film and the extra filmic, which is in the framework of the author or the production or the review, public and the state, that has also to be seen. So in that sense, we don't have to see only the dialogues, but also have to see that how the work is really represented. So the narrative of the film as well as the sets and the language, they have also to be understood, and symbols, the way they are seen to be in a way that they are the culture specific, they are also to be in a way analyzed by the people those who are engaged in the study of cinema. So in this context, we find that how the theoretical practical questions which are associated with the use of cinema, they are to be raised in a manner, in that sense that as a source of historical writing, we find that within the confines of the Indian historiography, they are able to do some kind of a research in that context. And it is also the question of the possibility of the use of cinema as a raw material of history of a specific era. Thereafter, we also see that how to study cinema to understand the socio-economic, political and the cultural reality. So all these kinds of ideas, they are there when one is talking about the films, and when one is talking about the films of a particular era, then we also see that how whether the events of that particular era, they are being reflected in the cinema, when one is trying to say that cinema is trying to reflect that particular kind of reality of those times. So we find that how to study cinema to understand the socio-economic, political and the cultural reality is an important kind of a concern in the recent debates as well. And we also have seen that scholars, they have in a way made a lot of effort to unearth some kind of meanings which are there in the films as well. So we find that when we talk about the national movement or the period when India was fighting its own war against the British to free themselves from the colonial shackles, we find that many of the genres or the themes on which the films they were being based, many of them they were being interpreted in their own way. And when you talk about the mythological and the religious character of the initial films, for example Raja Harishchandra, that how it was seen as a parallel to the philosophy of Satyagraha, how to endure suffering with faith in the ultimate victory of the good over evil, and how not only the courage but the spirit of the selfless sacrifice was needed to fight the British. So we find that these kind of interpretations, they were very relevant from the point of view when films they were being made in those times, because the Gandhian movement in the framework which is talking about Satyagraha or the implication of truth and non-violence, and how these kinds of tools they were very close to Gandhi's heart. And in the similar manner, we also find that these kinds of films, they were also propagating the kind of ideals which were very close to the national movement of those times. So in that sense, these kinds of interpretations, they were also being made concerning some of the films of that particular period. And apart from Raja Harishchandra, we also see that many of the films which were mythological in nature, or which were in a way quite contemporary, but they were being shown in a mythological manner. For example, there was a film called Bhakt Vidur, which was trying to connect the events of Mahabharat. But the way portrayals they were happening in that particular film, it was showing that it was very closely related to the events of the national movement. And then thereafter there was a film called Reth, which was made in 1931. And this film was also trying to convey the concerns of the national movement. And many times we find that the authorities, they got alarmed by such kind of presentations, and because of which we find that a number of censorship measures, they were being taken by these authorities to in a way cut the kind of scenes or the dialogues which were concerned with the revolutionary ideas or the ideas which were concerning democracy. So many of these films, they were being banned or excised during that point of time. And we also find that some of the films which were not directly connected to even the national movement, but the kind of ideas which they were trying to communicate, they were also being looked down upon by the British in a manner that how any kind of a patriotic feeling or the national sentiment may not arise among the masses. So in this context, we find that the film released, Sikandar was a film which was released in 1943, and during this time the Second World War was at its peak, and the political atmosphere was tense following the Gandhi's call for the Quit India movement, and Sikandar was arousing the patriotic feelings and the national sentiment. And how it was being banned for the screening in the military cantonment areas, because when the Porus was talking about driving out the aliens from Bharatvarsh, it could be understood as a reference to the British. So we find that such kind of portrayals, they were not being liked by the British. They were seen as some kind of a threat to their rule. And we also see that apart from this, movie of the same time or a film of the same time, Kismat, which was made in 1943, in which there was a song by poet Pradeep, आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है, दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है. So that song became some kind of a rallying point for the ideas in the context that how some kind of a reference to the British was there, because people, they were demanding that this song should be played again and again, and this film became a huge successful film because it was running continuously for more than 3 years in Roxy Cinema in Calcutta. So we find that these kinds of ideas which were being shown in the film, and when British, they got alarmed, then they sent an inspector rank person to find about the kind of things which were happening on the screen, and it was deduced that the reference was to the Germans and the Japanese and not to the British, because the next lyrics of the song, they say tum na kisi ke aage jhukna German ho ya Japani. So the matter was closed, but we find that this was one in a way the idea of hoodwinking the authorities in a manner. So we also see that how some of the national movement leaders, especially Gandhi, because that was the period of the Gandhian age, and how the issues of untouchability, women's emancipation, Hindu-Muslim unity, how they were central to the freedom movement, as you can see on the screen as well, and how Gandhi saw cinema as some kind of a vice, and he refused to see films. He only saw a film called Ram Rajya, which was made in 1943 by Vijay Bhatt. And in that context, K. Abbas wrote an open letter to Mahatma Gandhi that why he is so critical of cinema, and how Gandhi is being followed by so many people in India. And if Gandhi will have that kind of an aversion to cinema, then people, they will in a way resort to Gandhian ideas in the context of films. So he in a way asked Gandhi to come and watch films and give blessings to the film industry. So these were some of the ideas which were there with regard to the Gandhi, and we also see that how Bal Gangadhar Tilak wanted to open a film company with Dada Saheb Phalke, and how he was praising Dada Saheb Phalke when he was making Swadeshi films. So that idea of making indigenous and Swadeshi films was in a way supported by the national movement leaders, and many a times Lala Lajpat Rai was critical of the British censorship policy, and he was also critical of the imperial preferences which were being given to the British films. So we find that the people, those who were also connected with the national movement, they were also in a way concerned with the cinema as well, and how Sardar Patel lent his voice in a way in a kind of a speech for a film called Achut, and in 1940, and he also recorded some kind of a speech for a film called Brandi Chi Batli or Brandy Ki Bottle, which was again released in 1930s. And we also see that how Sardar Patel was also instrumental in that sense for getting the smuggled footage of the INA, the Indian National Army, and how this particular film was also produced by Sardar Patel, and this film was being shown at the Connaught Place to many national leaders. So we find that how the history in that sense, or the people, those who were associated with the national movement, the various important national leaders, they also realized the importance of cinema, Satyamurthy being one. And all of them, they were trying to communicate that how cinema was important in that sense. And but we find that cinema studies in that way could not take root that point of time. Some of the studies, they were being conducted, especially after independence. We find that, but not dedicated studies on cinema. They were being done in the institutions, and even the establishment of FTI in the 1960s was the first step towards in a way teaching cinema in an organized manner, funded by the government. So we find that there is still a need in that sense, that how we can utilize the potential of cinema in that sense, and how it can be used as a tool or as a kind of teaching pedagogy. So in that sense it will be very important, and at the same time it will also try to convey what all is happening in the society. So we'll talk further about this kind of an idea, that how cinema can be used as a teaching pedagogy, in our next lecture. Thank you very much.